In my childhood, I had a big and lively family. My mother came from a family of 3 sisters and 2 brothers. We would often gather with our extended family at our grandparents' house for holidays or weekends, filling the house with laughter, arguments, and the joyful noise of children. My cousins and I would run around in the beautiful garden, playing games, and just enjoying the boundless energy that comes with being young. One particular holiday stands out in my memory. I must have been around 6 or 7 years old at the time. My sister was 9, and my 2 older brothers were 12. It was likely during the New Year's holiday, because we stayed at our grandparents' house for a few days. One evening, we were all gathered in the living room, watching a concert of a folk ensemble on TV. The performers, dressed in traditional clothing, were beating wooden spoons rhythmically, making music in a way I had never seen before. Even before the concert had finished, we all had the same idea. Without a word, my cousins and I rushed to the kitchen, straight to my grandfather's old buffet cabinet, where we knew, from previous explorations, a stash of wooden spoons had been kept for as long as anyone could remember. The excitement of our newfound hobby was intoxicating. We divided the spoons as best we could, though there weren't enough for everyone, and most of them were old, chipped, or barely functional. Nonetheless, we took turns trying to mimic the rhythmic beats we had seen on TV. Of course, our enthusiasm quickly devolved into arguments and playful scuffles, but we were having the time of our lives. The adults, who usually dismissed our antics, paid no mind to our spoon playing. The only exception was our grandfather, who took great interest. He claimed to be a virtuoso of spoon playing and immediately jumped in to teach us the proper technique, how to hold the spoons just right and how to strike them to create that crisp, clattering sound. Every evening after that, we gathered around our grandfather, playing our makeshift spoon concerts while singing along to folk songs he would teach us. These were long, cold winter evenings, but they flew by in the warmth of the house, filled with music and laughter. After a few days, our holiday ended, and we returned home, leaving the spoons behind for the next visit. The next weekend, we eagerly returned to our grandparents' house. As soon as we walked in, we made a beeline for the buffet to retrieve our beloved spoons. But this time, they were gone. My brother asked, "Grandpa, where are the spoons?" Grandpa, with a mischievous grin, said, "You've played enough. Now it's time to find something else to entertain yourselves with." But our grandmother wasn't as amused. She muttered, "Oh, you don't know the trouble those spoons caused us after you left." Curious, we gathered around as she told the story of what had happened after our departure. The first night after we left, Grandma was awakened by a strange knocking sound coming from the kitchen. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. But as she listened, she realized it was real, the unmistakable sound of wooden spoons clattering together. It was slow and deliberate, a steady, unsettling rhythm. There was no one else in the house except her and Grandpa. She woke him up, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that? There's knocking in the kitchen." Grandpa, ever the skeptic, grumbled something about the cat knocking things over and shuffled to the kitchen to check. But when he arrived, the knocking wasn't there. Instead, it had moved to the living room, the very room we had been playing in earlier that day. He walked back toward the living room, only for the knocking to shift back to the kitchen. Realizing the eerie game he was caught in, Grandpa spat and muttered, "Let them knock if they want. I'm going back to bed." He returned to the bedroom, grumbling under his breath, and pretended to sleep, leaving Grandma wide-eyed and trembling until morning. The next day, she decided to take action. Armed with holy water, candles, and prayers, she blessed every corner of the house. But that night, the knocking returned, this time coming from another room, slower and more deliberate, almost as if mocking her efforts. Desperate, Grandma called over 2 of the neighbors, along with the schoolteacher from the village, a former seminarian, to help cleanse the house. Together, they recited prayers and performed rituals, determined to rid the house of whatever presence was causing the disturbance. As for Grandpa, he took a more pragmatic approach. He gathered all the wooden spoons, took them outside to the yard, and burned them. The flames crackled, and as the spoons turned to ash, he grumbled, "Let's see them knock now." That night, for the first time since we had left, the house was quiet. The spoons, or whatever had been causing the strange occurrences, seemed to have vanished along with the fire's smoke. Grandma and Grandpa never had another sleepless night, and though the house returned to normal, our beloved spoon-playing days were over. Even after all the fear and mystery, the story became one of our family's many legends, a strange, mystical tale that we told and retold during winter gatherings, though we never played with spoons again. Sometimes it's better to leave the music in silence. As the years went by, the story of the haunted spoons became one of those strange family legends we'd occasionally bring up around the holidays. We would laugh about how Grandpa grumbled his way through the mysterious events, and how Grandma had taken the whole thing so seriously, calling in neighbors and the old schoolteacher. But underneath the laughter, there was always a sense of unease, something about the events that didn't feel entirely explainable. Though we never touched wooden spoons for musical fun again, life went on, and we all grew up. My siblings and I moved on to new hobbies and interests, and soon enough we stopped visiting our grandparents' house as often. School, college, and life in general took over, and the mysterious nights of spoon-playing became a distant memory. But then something strange happened years later, during another family gathering. I was 19 at the time, home from university for the summer, and my parents had decided to host a reunion of sorts at our family home. My cousins, uncles, and aunts were all there, and we spent the evening reminiscing about old times, including the strange spoon episode that had happened all those years ago. Of course, someone brought it up, and we had a good laugh about it. Grandpa, now much older, but still sharp-witted, grinned when the story came up. "Those spoons had a mind of their own," he said, chuckling. But that was the last we ever heard from them, thank goodness. Later that night, after the gathering had died down and most people had gone to bed, I was sitting in the living room with my sister and 2 cousins. We were half asleep, sprawled out on the couches, when suddenly we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the kitchen. My cousin raised an eyebrow and laughed nervously. "No way! You hear that?" I shrugged, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "It's probably just the pipes or something," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. The sound was eerily familiar, too familiar. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, much like the way Grandma had described it all those years ago. My sister, always the skeptic, got up. "All right, I'll check. I'm not going to be scared of some old family ghost story." She walked into the kitchen, and for a few seconds the tapping stopped. But just as she was about to turn back and mock us for being scared, the noise started again, this time coming from the hallway behind her. We all sat up, alert now. There was no mistaking it. The sound was following her. My sister stood frozen for a moment, then slowly walked back into the living room, a nervous smile on her face. "Okay, I'll admit, that's creepy." My cousin tried to laugh it off. "Someone's pranking us," he said, looking around, but there was no one else awake. The house was dark and silent except for us. The tapping sound resumed, coming from the far end of the hallway now, moving closer. It wasn't loud, but it was steady and persistent, like someone was deliberately trying to catch our attention. Suddenly, we heard something even more unsettling, a faint, whispery voice, almost like a murmur, accompanying the knocking. We couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if the sound had a purpose, a message, and it was getting closer. We all sat frozen, unsure of what to do. My heart pounded in my chest, and the room seemed to grow colder. My sister, usually the brave one, looked at me with wide eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered. The tapping grew louder, as if whatever it was had moved into the living room with us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, none of us moved or said a word. We just sat there, waiting for something else to happen. But the house remained quiet, the mysterious tapping gone. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, though none of us could shake the feeling that something strange had happened. As we headed upstairs, I glanced back into the darkened living room, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. But there was nothing. The next morning, we brought up the strange occurrence to our parents, expecting them to laugh it off. But when we told Grandpa, he looked at us with a serious expression. "I told you," he said, his voice low. "Those spoons weren't just any spoons. There was something else at work that night. Grandma," overhearing the conversation, walked over. "You shouldn't play with things you don't understand," she said softly. "Some things are better left alone." We didn't press the issue further, but the unease lingered. Even though we tried to move on from that night, the memory of the knocking and the voice stayed with us. Years later, as I sat in my own apartment far from home, I would still think back to those strange nights. I'd wonder if the spoons had carried something with them, something that wasn't quite finished with our family. And though I never heard the knocking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that some mysteries never truly go away. They just wait in the shadows, biding their time until they're ready to make themselves known again. After that night, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could after such a strange event. My sister, cousins, and I didn't talk much about the tapping or the whispering voice that seemed to follow us in the living room, but we all felt the same unease whenever we thought back to it. The family gatherings continued as usual, and the spoon incident became more of a distant memory, just another family ghost story told during late-night conversations. But for me, the lingering discomfort never fully faded. I found myself drawn back to my grandparents' house more often, as if something was pulling me there. Every time I visited, I would catch myself listening carefully in the silence, half expecting to hear the tapping again, or perhaps a faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. Then, one quiet afternoon, about a year after the last incident, something new happened. I had gone to visit my grandparents for the weekend, just to check in on them and spend some time helping around the house. The day had been peaceful, filled with the usual chatter and reminiscing. But as evening fell, my grandfather pulled me aside, his face more serious than I had seen in a long time. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he looked over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "About those spoons." A chill ran down my spine at the mention of the spoons. We hadn't talked about them in years, and I had hoped we'd moved past that strange chapter. "What about them?" I asked, leaning in closer, my curiosity piqued. My grandfather sighed deeply, sitting down in his favorite armchair. "I never told your grandmother the full story, but those spoons, they didn't come from here. They were given to me by an old friend of mine, long before you were born. We were young, foolish, and we didn't think much about where things came from or what they might be tied to." He paused, his hands gripping the armrests as he continued. "My friend found them in an abandoned house, said they were part of an old family heirloom. I didn't think much of it at the time, but he insisted that there was something strange about them. He told me that whenever he had them in his possession, he'd hear things at night, voices, tapping, like something was trying to get his attention. The mention of tapping made the hairs on my neck stand on end. This was too close to what we had experienced all those years ago. I thought it was just his imagination," my grandfather continued, shaking his head. "But then, after he passed away, I ended up with the spoons. And that's when it all started happening. The knocks, the sounds. It followed me, but I never thought it would come back after I burned them." I sat there, stunned, as my grandfather told his story. He had always been a practical man, not one to entertain the supernatural or superstitions. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. "So why didn't you get rid of them sooner?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought I did," he replied, his voice grim. "But sometimes things don't leave as easily as you'd hope. Some objects, they carry more with them than just history. There are things tied to them that are harder to let go of." I didn't know what to say. The room seemed colder now, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "What should we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Grandpa looked at me, his expression somber. "I don't know if there's anything left to do. I thought by burning them, I'd put an end to it. But if it started again, well, We might not be done with this yet. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent my heart racing. I couldn't help but wonder if whatever was tied to those spoons had really been laid to rest, or if it was simply biding its time. The next morning, I decided to do some digging of my own. If there was more to the story of these spoons, I needed to find out what we were dealing with. I began researching local legends, old family stories, anything that might shed some light on the origins of spoons or the strange events that had plagued my family. What I found sent chills down my spine. There were old reports, dating back decades, of a family that had once lived in a house not far from where my grandfather's friend had found the spoons. The family was said to have practiced strange rituals, using everyday objects in ways that no one could explain. People in the village would hear strange noises coming from their house at night. Tapping, voices, even laughter, until one day the entire family vanished without a trace. The house was left abandoned for years, and eventually it fell into ruin. I brought my findings to my grandfather, who listened quietly as I explained the history behind the spoons. When I was finished, he sat back, looking more weary than I had ever seen him. "I had no idea," he said softly. "If I'd known, maybe I wouldn't have kept them. Maybe I wouldn't have brought this upon us." We didn't know what to do next. Burning the spoons hadn't seemed to work, but I wasn't sure what other options we had. All I knew was that the strange events seemed to be growing stronger, more persistent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, whatever it was, wasn't finished with us yet. Weeks passed without incident, and I hoped that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind us. But one night, as I was lying in bed at my own apartment, I heard it again, the tapping. Soft at first, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. It was coming from the corner of the room. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then, just like before, I heard it, the whisper. It was faint, but I could make out the words this time. "They're still here." That was when I knew. Whatever we thought we had gotten rid of, whatever we thought had been left behind, it had found a way back. And this time, it wasn't going to leave quietly.